Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Rob Murray. Alongside me is Aiden Rupert, and welcome to episode 12 of the WCHC Sports Podcast, where we discuss the latest news and updates from around the sports world. We are back from our brief week-long hiatus, and there is a lot to unpack. Aiden and I will discuss where the Dodgers and Rays are ahead of Game 6 of the World Series, recap a high-scoring Week 7 of the NFL season, and dissect the never-ending cycle of pain that is Atlanta sports. But before we get started, though, I'd like to ask you, Aiden, what was the first week of no NBA basketball like for you? First 2 weeks, I should say.
Yeah, Rob, I definitely appreciate you asking. And I guess my short answer is it's like a void you can never truly fill. I mean, you can obviously invest your energies elsewhere. I personally, not having the NBA to watch, I've turned my attention to NBA 2K21 more and more. Not necessarily the best outlet, but an outlet nonetheless. Obviously, I've picked up my viewership of TikTok significantly. Also, probably not the best development, but it is what it is, right? And at this point, I'm sort of banking on having the NBA sooner rather than later, as we'll touch on a little bit later on. We just don't know quite when the season is coming back at this point. So definitely, I'm still trying to work out the kinks of what exactly I'm going to do with my weeknights now, but I guess I have to remember this time of year, we're not really accustomed to having basketball as it is. So this was a little bit of bonus basketball that we just watched in the playoffs.
Yeah, I'd figure I'd check up on you, Aiden. I'm sure it's been very difficult without the NBA, but look on the bright side. We have college basketball about a month from now, so I'm sure that'll satisfy your basketball cravings. But let's move on to Major League Baseball and the start of the World Series. We had the Tampa Bay Rays defeating the Houston Astros in 7 games in the American League Championship Series, but made it very close. They nearly became just the second team to blow a 3-0 series lead. Obviously, that team being the 2004 New York Yankees at the hands of the Red Sox. But the Rays were powered by rookie Randy Arozarena. He hit .286 with 4 home runs and 6 RBIs in the League Championship Series, became the first rookie position player to win such an award in that particular series. And Aiden Arozarena, I feel like unsung postseason heroes have become a hallmark of this podcast. We talked about Yoel Kiviranta of the Dallas Stars. We talked in depth about Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson of the Miami Heat. And Randy Arozarena is just the newest player to be added to this list. He played only 23 games with the Rays this season, made brief appearances with the St. Louis Cardinals in 2019, and he just got hot at the right time as the Rays were approaching their postseason run, and he is certainly a huge reason why they've gotten as far as they have.
Yeah, Rob, I think with Arozarena, obviously they trail 3-2 in the World Series, as we'll talk about here. You never know. I think that when you look at the World Series and where things are at right now, I think that Seager is probably your favorite to take home that World Series MVP award. But you look at a guy like Arozarena from Tampa Bay, and he's not obviously the favorite if Tampa Bay were to come out on top to take home the award. But you talk about that narrative that he has behind him right now as being the unsung postseason hero. You think about the Yoel Kirivantas and even the Andre Iguodalas of the world, right? So there's definitely some sort of narrative work that goes into that. And obviously we'll touch on what exactly we saw a few nights ago that was so remarkable, but definitely a compelling storyline to watch in this series and in series past.
Absolutely. And you brought up Corey Seager, and that gives me a nice little transition into the Dodgers. They beat the Braves in 7 games, and the Dodgers became the first team since the 2016 World Series champions, my Chicago Cubs, to come back from a 3-1 series deficit in the postseason. Seager, a big reason why. He hit .310, 5 home runs, and 11 RBIs in that series en route to an NLCS MVP. And Aiden Arozarena and Seager continue to lead their teams throughout this World Series. Arozarena, as of Game 4, broke the postseason home run record with 9, breaking Derek Jeter's all-time mark of 8. Seager, who also has 8 home runs this postseason, was once plus 1,200 to win World Series MVP for all you bettors out there. But now he's the odds-on favorite, with the Dodgers just one win away from their first title since 1988. But Aiden, let's talk about Game 4, because I think this is going to go down as one of the greatest games in World Series history. And I'm scrolling through our texts going back to, I believe it was Saturday night, right after the Rays won that game. You texted me that is going to make the podcast tomorrow night, with a little surprise emoji to top it off after. And you're absolutely right. It deserves to make the podcast. It deserves to make every conversation about great World Series games from here on out. It was back and forth all night, multiple lead changes, especially towards the end of the game. And the final play is what's going to go down in history. The Rays down 7-6, one strike away from going down 3-1, effectively ending the series. And Brett Phillips, a guy who was traded mid-season from the Royals and had just 17 regular season at-bats with the Rays this year, rips a single into center field, scores. Kevin Kiermaier from second base. The Dodgers center fielder Chris Taylor has trouble with the ball, and there comes Randy Arozarena around third base. He falls and looks dead in the water. I know you were watching. He looked dead to the rights, given that the Dodgers were going to make a solid throw to home, but they didn't. The ball gets away. Arozarena gets up and dives onto home plate, slams it a few times for good measure, and the Rays make it a real series, tying it up 2-2.
Yeah, Rob, I think in some ways it's almost a shame that this fateful play is going to be the one that goes down in history, and rightfully so. I mean, it was one of the most shocking moments we've seen across all of baseball for years now. Truly, there was no way. It's like everything aligned for that to happen. The stars aligned just right. In no other world does that happen, but I just don't want that to take away from how compelling the entire game was. And that's actually what I was making fun of my dad for. He was just on the couch, passed out, as dads do, right? And there's a heck of a baseball game going on, whether you're a diehard baseball fan or a casual fan like myself. And he told me the next morning, he's like, "Oh, dude, it was crazy. I woke up just in time for the last play." And I was like, "Did you really, though?" I kind of have a feeling he slept through it. But I will say, a couple of years back now, I remember Damian Lillard hitting that 35-footer on the Oklahoma City Thunder to send them packing. It was an instance where I was in my dorm room. Shout out to Clark Hall. Shout out to Jack and Mike, my roommates at the time. I was literally just out cold on my bed watching that game, laptop on my chest. I sleep through the whole third and fourth quarter, and then by some miracle, I wake up with about 5.3 seconds to go on the clock, Damian Lillard dribbling it out and then pulling from 35. So maybe it was that kind of a moment for him. But whether or not he truly caught it, we did see something historic unfold the other night.
We certainly did. And that game, I believe, showed that the Rays were in this series to stay. I mean, you looked at the first 3 games they played. They were largely dismantled in games 1 and 3, not much of a contest. And in game 2, the only game they had won up until that point, was very tightly contested. So a lot of questions about the Rays being a legitimate World Series contender against the Dodgers were kind of quelled with that, again, incredible 8-7 win. And while I give props to the Rays, I'll give props to you, Aiden. Pulling a dad move like that and falling asleep on the couch for hours on end in the middle of a great game is something that only a few people can do. So hats off to you. But let's move on to the NFL, where this Sunday we saw a battle of 2 5-0 teams, the Steelers and the Titans. Steelers walk away with a win 27-24 on a missed field goal as time expired from former Patriots kicker Stephen Gostkowski. Many Patriots fans who listen to this podcast will remember how efficient and reliable he was for that team for such a long time, but he's dealt with his fair share of kicking inaccuracies in 2020. If you remember, Aiden, this game was supposed to be played back in week 4, but was delayed due to the Titans' COVID outbreak. And it marked the 5th time in the Super Bowl era that two undefeated teams played week 7 or later. And guess what, Aiden? The 4 winners of such games have gone on to the Super Bowl. So if history is an accurate predictor, we'll see Pittsburgh aiming for their 7th Super Bowl title. That would be the most in NFL history, surpassing the Patriots, who tied them with their Super Bowl win just a few years ago.
Yeah, Robin, I think that definitely, Tennessee ultimately came up short in this one, probably to the joy of NFL fans across the country who have been just ruthless in their cheers against the Tennessee Titans the past several weeks. But I think there are some positives to be taken away from the game. Obviously, they were playing against an undefeated squad, and they had one heck of a second half comeback run, fall up just short. But I was surprised that they had the resiliency even to push that game into overtime. And you're right, Rob. It is an interesting little aside on Gostkowski being the former Patriots kicker. Everything sort of comes full circle when it comes to the NFL, and this was one of those moments.
Absolutely. Nobody is safe, not even former Patriots kickers. You saw Adam Vinatieri last year, a legend for the Patriots, 2 Super Bowl winning kicks back in the early 2000s, essentially kicked his way out of his final season in the NFL. Just a brutal performance last year. But speaking of the Patriots, Aiden, let's move on to, I'll say, the Bucs and the Patriots, because I think these two teams will always be viewed side by side this season. New England just looked all out of sorts this Sunday. Cam Newton threw 3 picks in a 33-6 home loss against the 49ers. He took responsibility after the game. He was benched for Jarrett Stidham, who's not exactly a world-breaking talent. But on the flip side, Tom Brady, with his new team, went for 370 yards and 4 touchdowns in a win over the Las Vegas Raiders. And I think it's interesting how much perceptions have changed, Aiden. It was only about a month ago that we were talking, how well the Patriots were playing with this new look offense guided by Cam. He looked dynamic. He was moving the ball across the field. He was taking it in himself. And Tom Brady looked to struggle at times throughout his first few games with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But the Bucs look like an NFC contender at this point in time. And the Patriots, we don't know if they're even built to make the playoffs at this point. There have been rumors that they're going to go out and trade for a top receiver for Cam Newton, but I don't know if that even begins to scratch the surface of the problems that they're experiencing right now, especially considering that they've had their bouts of COVID that have limited them in practice time and ultimately translated to, I believe, 3 straight losses now for New England.
No, Rob, I don't think it does start to really scratch the surface. And I think you're right in saying that the Bucs and Pats really sort of go hand in hand, or will be measured against each other all season long, maybe even into next season. But given that's the case, I think that New England, they really have their work cut out for them. Obviously, they're still under a great head coaching regime, and they have Cam Newton, who we talked about in earlier podcasts. But Tampa Bay, they're really showing us something right now. We saw just a week ago Tom Brady and the Buccaneers absolutely dismantle Aaron Rodgers and the Packers in what I'd like to call the Geezer Bowl. And we saw maybe a slightly more compelling victory this week, although the Packers have done well for themselves this season too. But Tom Brady was really just on his game last season, or rather the other day, last game. And so I think that definitely, while your assessment of Patriots and Buccaneers definitely being stacked up against one another all season long, I think we are starting to see a little bit of separation in terms of where we consider these teams. And I think Patriots' upcoming game against the Buffalo Bills, who sort of hit a bit of a slump of their own, that's really going to be a telling game for the trajectory of the remainder of the season for New England.
Absolutely. And I liked that Geezer Bowl name. We're going to see another one between Tom Brady and Drew Brees later in the season. So I'll have to hit you up for that again later on.
Geezer Bowl.
With the Cardinals, Aiden, they handed the Seahawks their first loss of the season on Sunday Night Football. Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins, these two guys are going to be around for a long time, and they're going to rack up a lot of yards and a lot of touchdowns. They combined for 10 receptions, 103 yards, and a touchdown last night. Russell Wilson, who is really the consensus MVP candidate as of right now, with a very uncharacteristic 3 interceptions, including one late in overtime. He didn't have his best game, despite the Seahawks still putting up 34 points. And Aiden, tell me if you had Tyler Lockett on any of your fantasy teams. He had 53 fantasy points, easily the greatest total of the season. I had Devontae Adams on my team, and he went for, I think, something like 46. And I thought for sure that I had the highest score of the week. But in comes Tyler Lockett with, I think it was 14 catches. Let me verify this. Yeah, 15 catches, 200 yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, 53 fantasy points. Please tell me you had him.
No, I can't tell you I had Tyler Lockett anywhere on my radar or anywhere nearly or anywhere remotely near my radar. But I'll tell you who did, one of my friends, and he was not afraid to let us know about it. But since we're talking about fantasy real quick, I mean, this game definitely had implications for me, or at least it almost did. I was in a position where I was absolutely blowing out the opposition. I got to a point where basically the only thing that could beat me would be Kyler Murray going for something like 45, 46 points. And so here I am watching the fantasy scoreboard almost obsessively and realizing he might get there. He's getting close. He ended up with 37, between 37 and 38 points on the game. And so I was sitting there sweating bullets, which is not something I usually do. But definitely Tyler Lockett sort of stole the show in this one.
He sure did, and Kyler did come very close to that 45 mark. As I mentioned before, he was phenomenal as well. He was an early season MVP candidate coming out of the NFC West, and I think he'll be neck and neck with Russell Wilson the rest of the way. But Aiden, let's move on to our assists, fumbles, and what to watch for. Why don't you kick us off with your assist?
Yeah, so my assist for this week, I got to hand it to our friends, quote, friends over at Turner or TNT. They are, I can't believe I just mentioned ourselves in the same breath as Turner Network Television. I love that.
We'll get there. We're slowly but surely. We're the new Shaq and Chuck. We'll
right
get there eventually.
I think that's what I was thinking. But anywho, TNT, they are airing toward the end of November, The Match 3.0, which will actually feature Charles Barkley, you just mentioned, alongside Phil Mickelson, and they are going head-to-head with Steph Curry and Peyton Manning in a supposedly friendly round of golf. We saw sort of during the onset of the pandemic back in May, we saw the match 2 featured Tiger Woods and Peyton Manning against Mickelson and Tom Brady. And this event, Rob, the match 2 back in May, it was the highest rated golf event ever to appear on live television. Very interestingly, it raised over $20 million for COVID-19 relief. And what we see with the upcoming charity, the Match 3.0, it will benefit historically Black colleges and universities. And it is set to air on Friday, November 27th. And I got to say, Steph Curry, he's no stranger to the game of golf. I'm not saying he's any Michael Jordan in that regard. MJ, you hear these legendary stories about him out there for hours and hours on game day, but definitely Steph Curry has a little something in his bag that I'm not quite sure Charles Barkley can match.
Yeah, I'm not sure what TNT was thinking, asking Charles Barkley to come play, even if he's being paired with, a professional golfer like Phil Mickelson. It'll be very interesting to see Chuck out on the course and sporting his notoriously bad golf swing. But November is a great month for golf fans. You got the Masters starting on November 12th, and you've got the Match 3 on November 27th. And if you remember going back to the Match 2 with Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Tiger, and Phil Mickelson, you had everything from Tom Brady ripping his pants on live television to him straining, I believe it's an eagle from over 100 yards out. So I'm really excited to see what happens in the Match 3 on our friends at the Turner Network. My assist of the week is the Big Ten making its long-awaited return to NCAA football. Conference powerhouses like Ohio State and Michigan scored big wins and took care of business on their opening weekend, but other teams like number 8 ranked Penn State suffered a crushing 36-35 overtime loss at the hands of unranked Indiana. on a very controversial final play that literally came down to inches. Aiden, I don't know if you saw the picture circulating social media, but Indiana's quarterback dove for the pylon on the last play, and the ball just, it looked like it barely touched the out of bounds line before hitting the pylon, but not according to the refs. They ruled it a touchdown and upheld that call. But regardless, it was a great week of Big Ten football, and as perhaps the premier college football conference, with the exception of the SEC, I'm thrilled to see that they were able to safely return to play and kind of figure things out before it got too late.
I'm with you on that, Rob. And that will move us on to our fumbles segment for this week. For my fumble of this week, I am going to say Atlanta.
Yeah, my fumble's Atlanta too. I don't think we'll need to explain it, but we will, because it's Atlanta and we love to make fun of Atlanta on this podcast now. So let's take a bit of a walk through history, Aiden, on futility in Atlanta sports. We'll start with the Braves, since we talked about baseball at the top of the show. So in 2020, obviously the Braves blow their 3-1 NLCS lead to the Dodgers. It would be their first time going back to the World Series in almost 20 years. But I guess they had golf reservations or meal reservations or whatnot, so they decided to lose 3 straight. In 2019, the Braves forced a Game 5 NLCS, only to give up 10 runs in the first inning of that Game 5 and lost 13-1. So that was a nice thank you gift to their really devoted fan base, who I'm sure is just pouring out the Don Julio at this point in droves. Aiden, why don't you tell us what the Hawks did, a largely irrelevant team for the last few years. What did they do in 2018?
Well, it was all sort of precipitated by their accumulation of draft capital. They had a couple of losing seasons after the 60-win Hawks team we saw right around 2014, 2015, I think it was. They won 60 games, then fizzled out in the playoffs, and then they were confined to a few years of mediocrity at best. And so that ended up leading to them having a top draft selection, and they were in prime position to draft now sensation Luka Doncic. And instead they chose to trade the pick, and they took Trae Young, and the rest is history. And let's be fair here, which I don't like using the words fair in Atlanta in the same sentence, given we love to attack them. Trae Young, he's a heck of a player. I think that he's going to go down as an all-star for several seasons. He may even have a shot at the Hall of Fame, just looking at his sophomore campaign numbers, if he can maintain that to any extent. It's the worst trade that's not even a bad trade in NBA history. It's so easy to say that's an awful trade. It's Luka Doncic, right? Trae Young is an amazing player, but it's just sort of emblematic of, something that could go wrong for Atlanta sports going wrong, which is what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, I want to say that's so Atlanta, because even on a pick that would have been a home run for most, if not all, teams in the NBA, considering what Trae Young has done and what he looks like he's going to do across, the next decade of his NBA career, you could have had Luka Doncic. I mean, this guy was insane this year. He lit the bubble playoffs on fire for the time that he was in. He's a franchise-altering talent. Not to say that Trae Young isn't, but I don't think he is to the extent that Luka Doncic is. Let's just move on.
Yeah.
Even when Atlanta wins, they lose somehow, which we'll get to actually very quickly. But first, we're going to talk about the Georgia Bulldogs. 2018, they blow a 20-7 lead to Alabama in the national championship game. Tough loss, but it was Tua Tagovailoa. That was where his legend kind of started, leading that comeback. We'll give you a break. 2019 comes around, SEC championship game. Georgia wins. They're in the playoff. They might even get the number 1 seed in college football, and they have a lead in the fourth quarter. I'm sure you can guess what happened next. They blew that lead. And Alabama beats them once again. Georgia misses out on the playoff. Alabama returns to the title game. And this time they didn't even lose to Tua. They were putting the clamps, so to speak, on Tua the whole game. And Jalen Hurts, the guy who was benched for Tua in the 2018 national championship game, comes back into the game, scores 2 touchdowns, breaks Georgia hearts once again. But a mockery of Atlanta would not be complete without the Falcons, Aiden. We all know about 28-3, 2017. But 2020, 3 blown fourth quarter leads. And I don't know, would you like to explain what happened this past week, or were you not able to catch them?
No, you know what, Rob? I would love to explain what happened this week, and I'm going to do so in layman's terms. Basically, you run into a situation where you have a good shot at winning, but it's going to be beneficial to you to run a little bit of clock out while doing it, intentionally let the time tick down. And so what we saw from the Atlanta Falcons was inadvertently scoring a touchdown before they had allowed that much time to run down on the clock. You saw a player accidentally run into the end zone, just slide into the end zone inexplicably. I mean, clearly you could see the look on his face. He meant to stop. He wanted to stop, but that just isn't what happened. And so long story short, that amount of time that Atlanta did not allow to run off the clock, it came back to bite them, and they lost.
That's right. Todd Gurley fails to stay out of the end zone. You don't hear that very often.
Right.
The Falcons could have just run the clock down. I believe the Lions were out of timeouts with about a minute remaining. So run down the clock 2-3 seconds, call timeout, kick a 20-ish yard field goal, game over, you win. Second win in a row for the Falcons. But even they can't do that. Gurley falls forward into the end zone. His momentum carries him over the line, gives Matt Stafford and the Lions about a minute to work with. And, of course, they drive down the field, score a touchdown, kick the game-winning extra point. Lions win 23-22. Falcons drop to 1-6 with their owner, who somehow has not jumped ship, watching on the sidelines with a very sad mask on his face. But let's give Atlanta a break. I'm sure we'll be back for them next week.
Yep.
Let's move on to our final segment, what to watch for. Aiden, tell me about the NBA scheduling. I know you mentioned it earlier in the show. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so the reason it's really something to watch for in this next week or so is just because any minute we could receive some news on A, what time next season or what date next season's actually going to tip off, and B, for the more immediate future, when is free agency actually going to happen? Because what we're seeing right now is obviously the NBA can't start their free agency period without knowing exactly what the salary cap situation is going to look like. They have to calculate all the revenue lost throughout the pandemic, exactly how many games they're going to be able to have. Will there be fans in attendance? So there are so many variables that need to be considered. But that said, league executives are meeting. They've been meeting the last couple of days, according to reports. And so any day now we could see some sort of information on what this is all going to look like. And one thing it's worth mentioning is December 22nd, actually, so less than 2 months from today, it's actually been thrown out there, according to reports, of a potential start date for the 2020-2021 season. And to me, I agree with Danny Green of the Los Angeles Lakers. Danny Green, he's on record saying that that's way too soon, and that if he's LeBron in that situation, he's taking a couple months off after the season begins just because of how soon it is after the Lakers championship run. And I think that actually a lot of NBA stars and role players, for that matter, are going to agree with Danny Green on that one. I'm sure there are players like the Atlanta Hawks who are chomping at the bit to get back into action. But at the same time, a 2-month off season for teams like the Heat and the Lakers just doesn't quite cut it. So as much as I personally would love to have basketball back ASAP, you got to consider free agency. Don't know when it is. NBA draft, it's set, but you're really going to tell me you're going to get these rookies into their markets and suited up, trained up for a season within 1 month of the draft? To me, I'm not buying it, but here's hoping that the league officials really come up with something creative, as they did with the Orlando bubble.
Yeah, I hope so too. It is a little ambitious, I will agree, to pin that December 22nd date as the start. I was hearing rumors about a potential MLK Day start for the NBA. I don't know if you've seen similar
Yeah.
news.
The thing is, Rob, that's a little more realistic in my book. And so much of this depends on if the NBA says, okay, we're gonna just do this with no fans. We're gonna take the revenue hit for the sake of maintaining our obligation to our TV partners and playing something close to an 82 game season. And keep in mind also, they're trying to get all of this done before the 2021 Olympics, which are set to take place next summer. And so there is real pressure on the league to
Yeah,
get the season out of the way as soon as possible. But at the same time, yeah, I agree. December 22nd is ambitious, and Martin Luther King Day, it sounds a lot more viable.
definitely. And you bring up the Olympics, actually. I forgot that they were happened that I just completely blanked on. I think a great segment for future episodes, especially since the World Series will be wrapping up, and all we'll really have to talk about is the NFL for a couple months. Dream scenarios for the 2021 U.S. Olympic team. Maybe throw together some potential rosters we'd like to see out there. But let me move on to my what to watch for to wrap things up. Antonio Brown is back. NFL fans, he plans on signing a one-year deal with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers once his suspension is, of course, uplifted after Week 8. Brown is a four-time All-Pro who has twice led the league in receptions and receiving yards. He'll be reunited with Tom Brady a little over a year since his dramatic exit from the NFL and joins a loaded Tampa Bay offense with names like Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Ronald Jones, Leonard Fournette, and Rob Gronkowski catching passes from Tom Brady. And those guys look like they're peaking at just the right time. Tampa Bay has strung a couple really nice wins together. Their defense and Tom Brady's, been getting more comfortable with his offense. They're looking like one of the NFC's top contenders. And you wonder if Brown's antics and history for kind of being a prima donna, crying about targets, and how many catches he get will throw off their chemistry, much like Aiden, kind of like how Kyrie Irving did with the Boston Celtics. You had, a really young upstart team that looked like it was gelling. The pieces were falling into place. The next few years looked very promising. And bring in a guy like Kyrie Irving, you think, wow, things can't get any better. We're finals contenders. And it turns out it really just created a dumpster fire. And we found out this year that the absence of Kyrie Irving for the Celtics turned out to be the best thing, as your Boston team was just 2 wins away from an NBA Finals appearance. So as much as I'd like to see Antonio Brown return to form, he's an incredible player when healthy and in the right mindset. I even scooped him up in fantasy on the off chance that he'd go off for the next few weeks, but remains to be seen how he'll do. And I'd like to get your thoughts, considering you come from the perspective of a fan of a team that brought in a very talented player, but that same player ended up destroying a lot of chemistry and important intangibles of that squad.
Yeah, it's a good question, Rob. I think that obviously this tells us a lot about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and where they hope to be by season's end. Obviously, they're sort of aiming very high with this one and really looking to establish really an elevated ceiling for themselves. But I think that the chemistry consideration is an important one. And take a look at Rob Gronkowski, for instance. I think, in my personal opinion, he's taken a little bit more of a laid-back professional approach to things this season with Tampa Bay, maybe sort of looking to change the narrative on Psycho Gronk, as we've seen throughout many years of his career. But here's my one worry if I'm a Tampa Bay fan, is if there's anyone that's going to sort of bring back the old Gronk antics, it's probably going to be Antonio Brown. And likewise, I think that those two alongside each other, it could be great. It really could. It could be great on the field and frankly off the field too. But there always will be this small risk of implosion. And I'm just sort of visualizing Antonio Brown pulling up for his first practice with the Buccaneers. And you have Tom Brady on the one hand, a calm voice of reason in AB's head. And then you see Gronk sort of playing devil's advocate in his conscience and just like telling him we want AB unleashed. So they're rolling the dice, in my opinion, like I said, sort of raising the ceiling for themselves. But I would say in doing so, they're definitely or probably setting themselves a bit of a lower floor as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because Bruce Arians, the Buccaneers coach, said at the beginning of the season when Antonio Brown rumors were circulating around that team, he said, "We don't have room for Antonio Brown. Like, we will not be signing him this season." And lo and behold, halfway through, he's packing his bags for Tampa. So it's all a very interesting situation. You bring up Gronk, he's been great the last few weeks. So maybe Tampa Bay has discovered the fountain of youth with Brady, Gronk, and hopefully AB returning to form in this 2020 season.
And one last thing, Rob, I think that also, just since we're talking about star receivers, we would be remiss if we did not mention the injury to Odell Beckham that we saw this week in football. Right. Unfortunately, the star receiver tore his ACL early on. It was actually an interception thrown by the quarterback, Mayfield, and OBJ basically pivoted, turned around to try and get the tackle, and he eventually impeded the offensive player's progress. But there was sort of a weird situation where he just went for the plant, and you could see it on the replay in slow-mo. His leg gave out, and then we saw like a weird hop from him where basically he just toppled over the opposing player. It was almost like what we saw, and I hate to do this to you, Rob, but like the Derrick Rose when we saw D Rose driving right into the paint. We saw him go for the jump stop, plant, something buckled, but we still saw this bunny hop into the air where he sort of starts flailing, and you're just like, okay, he may have come down on that. Kind of weird.
Yeah, as much as I hate to bring up Derrick Rose, I think you're spot on with that. It was just one of those weird non-contact injuries that you hope doesn't compromise any of OBJ's explosiveness and talent as a player. I mean, when you think of some of the more explosive guys in the NFL, OBJ tops that list. He's had a couple phenomenal plays this season that have allowed the Browns to get to where they are at 5-2. But yeah, it remains to be seen how OBJ fares. He's obviously done for the season. He'll be focusing his efforts on getting back and healthy for next season. But to end on that note, that's going to be it for episode 12 of the WCHC Sports Podcast. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. And don't forget to let us know what you'd like to hear us talk about during episode 13, which we'll have for you at the same time next week. We'll be wrapping up the World Series, NFL Week 8, and maybe throw in a few fun segments about basketball, tennis, or whatever may cross our minds at the time. For Aidan Rupert, I'm Rob Murray, signing out.